Today I will be going back to alternative history, and I will be covering what if World War II happened in the 60s. Now before we start, note that this is highly unrealistic, but now without further stalling, let's get into it. The year is 1933, and a failed Austrian artist is in power in Germany, and I will start sharing his beliefs on what he must do. Firstly, he wants to remilitarize Germany and create the biggest and best army in Europe, if not the globe. Secondly, he wants to control all of Eastern Europe for German livings. This includes the invasion of the Balkans, Poland, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviets. And thirdly, he only wants pure Germans, which would mean, war crime. We all know what he's gonna do. So now that we know the basics of what his goals were, we need to change something in history to prevent World War II until at least 1960. I believe we should stop the madman earlier, so we'll start with him being able to militarize like in our timeline, but when he threatens Austria, that's when things start to get heated. The British would not want the Germans to gain too much power, but again, they need to buy some time, because the British and French war strategy was to let the Germans just have some stuff, and that would buy them some time. So that's what appeasement is, if you are wondering. The Germans would see this as a huge win. It would have nearly full trust in the new dictator. A few years later, he demands Czechoslovakia. And this is where the scenario gets kinda messy. On one side, the dictator would start World War II. Either way, we have it. So I can't have that happening for the sake of the scenario. So I must do this instead. Germany will try to invade Czechoslovakia, but as soon as they get their army in, France declares war and starts an invasion from the west. Note that Germany wouldn't be prepared for this, and they'd mostly just be having a bluff there. Probably have a small amount of military force there, but not enough to stop the French army. But the French ain't going in to demolish Germany, they're just going in there to do something. This, in my mind, will at least create a huge anger in the military, and I feel like it could lead to a military coup of the nation. Why do I say this? Well, yes, the dictator has his supporters who can argue against the army. So, the army will just go in and take care of the dictator, because they don't actually care. Because, the army will do what the army wants. It's not like the mustache man had a full army just in his capital. They would then take care of the dictator, and then they would sign for peace with France. And the peace deal, France would originally want Germany to give back annexed lands like Austria and Czechoslovakia, as well as some land from the Rhine. But I think the British wouldn't agree to this, as they can shape Germany in many ways now. And why make them mad again? That is the question. And so, they agree to keep the German borders the same. Now, what will the new government be like? I think the government will be split between being a monarchy or an oligarchy. So which will it be? I don't think this would cause a German civil war, but it would cause some trouble. I will call this the German governing crisis. How will it be solved? Well, it's simple. They will try and brutally take out each other, as politicians did in the time and still try to do today. And while not being a civil war, it would still cause major damages to Germany in the short term. But at the end of the day, I feel like the oligarchy would win, as the monarchy would leave many to wonder, who would the new leader even be? Well, my answer would be Wilhelm's grandson, which would technically be called Wilhelm III. Who is to know for sure, as history can change in many ways with alternate history. So the new government is an oligarchy. But who are the people in charge? Are they bad? I feel like they would be very much bad, but not as bad as the dictator before them. While some may think of a military conquest, it won't happen anytime soon, because they have to repair Germany back up to what happened when they damaged it in the German government crisis. But what is happening elsewhere? Italy and Japan would still try some things, but I feel like Japan would do much better. They would wall up China, actually, but at what cost? They would slowly lose resources, which would make them turn to attacking the Allies. This would prove a huge mistake. While Japan attacking both Britain and France, they would basically sign a death wish. Both superpowers would send over a bunch of men at the Japanese. While the Japanese have the advantage at first, they would soon lose the land they gained as soon as the Allied troops landed. As the Germans aren't rampaging around Europe at the time, the Japanese would be facing a brutal force. Because in our timeline, the Germans kind of let the Japanese take Asia because of taking out France, and the British were much more focused on Europe anyways. It may take until 1944, but the Japanese would be defeated nonetheless. And before they go and attack Pearl Harbor, they would think to themselves, is this worth it? But since the generals were crazy at the time, they would attack it anyway, bringing the Americans into the war. While very controversial, I still think the Americans would make nukes and nuke both cities like in our timeline. That is good news for Godzilla fans, bad news for all the civilians. Because like in our timeline, it would cause tens of thousands of deaths. And that's just in the blast zone. Not even counting for the radiation, which would definitely kill tens of thousands more. But what would the peace deal look like after this war? Firstly, Japan would leave all territory attacked after the Americans broke their economy. Secondly, Japan would have to be a democracy. What happened to the Japanese emperor? I think he'll still be around like in our timeline. But now what happens with the land Japan lost? Korea would be set up as a democratic state, as why would they be communist anyway? Manchuria may also be formed as a democratic nation, but I think they might be left for China, because I don't think they'd necessarily want to anger all of China, especially as their civil war is starting to end. Speaking of which, who wins the Chinese Civil War? I think the communists would still win. There's no reason for them not to. So now this is how Asia is looking. Now back to Europe. Germany has spent the last decade making the economy stronger, and will now start to militarize again at the start of the 1950s. This will be met with criticism as the Allies don't want to remilitarize Germany. But I feel like the rest of Europe would be defending Germany here, as the Allies are punishing them too hard for something they willingly stopped. Because they did a whole civil conflict, not a civil war, but they stopped their old dictator. And who knows what could have happened if that man with the funny mustache was still in power. I guess we'll never know. It's not like Germany wasn't an oligarchy in our timeline, definitely. Anyways, let's move on. So the Germans will build up their military until 1960. And what happens with Italy? Italy was a big ally of the Germans, so what happened now? I think they would still try a war with Albania, but after that, they can't do anything. They would try to invade Greece, but that would instantly backfire. But I don't think they would try that in this timeline, so I think Italy just has to wait until an opportunity comes. This would have the Italian people just kind of like shaking around their fists. Come on, Mussolini, you can do much better. Show our military might. Note how I never mentioned the Soviets until now. Well, there is a reason for that. They would be stopped by the Allies. They would annex the Baltics, but then they can't invade Poland or Germany because the Allies would take that as a European safety breach. Even though the British dislike the Germans, they must stay alive for balance. But the British would soon have another crisis to watch out for. As the colonies would start rebelling, they would start the slow process of decolonization. Although they really don't want to, but come on. Who can really fend off millions of people? I'm guessing that a lot of people would sign up to fight for their, and I don't think the British would have the strong enough force to stop it, although they would still be big. But now with the colonies rebelling, they would have no external troops to go get. And I don't think they would spend all their manpower on that. They would set up the colonies for partial independence, while in reality they would still be used for cheap resources and manpower. So they can get some manpower, but not too much. They would still have a limit. I guess their empire still technically exists. But as soon as this happens, the Soviets would declare war on Poland. They would annex most of it. But now they need to pin it on someone, so who would join them? I would say Germany, but they don't want to risk war just yet. So the Soviets just annex eastern Poland and set up a puppet in the West. But now the Allies would get in a meeting with Germany and Italy to discuss the future of Europe, and they would come to an agreement to all work together to take down the Soviets. This may seem a bit far-fetched, but I don't think it is, considering how everybody hated communism in general. This would be known as Operation Red Tape, so now Allied, German, and Italian troops would get on the border with the Soviets. And as soon as it became summer, the coalition would declare war against the Soviets. The Soviets would be very much caught off guard, which is quite ironic considering that I'd assume that they'd be watching their borders carefully after that, but I guess not. Because let's be honest, the Soviets, until the Cold War happened, the Cold War has still not happened, so they wouldn't be as careful as in our timeline, which would kind of explain why they'd be caught off guard. and plus they were caught off guard in our timeline when the Germans attacked. The Soviets would be surprised again as the Finnish would join the war shortly after. This would have 3 times the manpower and logistics Operation Barbarossa had. But soon some countries would come to the aid of the Soviets, those being China, Bulgaria, and all the old British and French colonies. Why would they do this, you ask? Well, the answer is simple. They hate each other. They hate the British and French colonies, hate the British and French, of course, but I feel like Bulgaria's allied with the Russians, so they'd probably do that, and China is the only other communist nation, so I don't feel like they would want the Soviets to be knocked down. But Operation Red Takedown would start working, and the Soviets would lose massive amounts of land. But unlike in our timeline, the Finnish would actually capture Leningrad, also known as St. Petersburg for you people now, thus making the Soviets have a much worse moral crisis. But it's not like the Soviets would stop fighting altogether. They would still send over millions of troops. But what matters is the logistics and the timing of the Soviet offensive. For the best timing, it would be best for them to wait until the winter, but I would expect the coalition to have prepared for the winter at least. They would at least know to be prepared for the winter because, let's be honest, war with the Soviets means that you need to at least wait until the winter, or winter warfare will be decided either way. So this is another point where a problem is reached. While yes, the Allies are in a coalition, they also have to deal with millions more troops than in our time. I wouldn't say the Chinese would send the masses in, but they would still send at least 100,000 troops to prevent the only other communist nation from collapse. So, some would say that the Chinese would send 1 million or more troops, but I don't think that's the case. Chinese just got out of a civil war, so I don't think it would be on the table for them at the time. So, I see the war going down this way. They went against the Soviets, but it wouldn't take much longer than planned. Or it would take much longer than planned. But on the other hand, they must accept losing all their colony. I feel like this would work out for the peace deal. Because let's be honest, they could string out the war as long as possible, but they would still have to deal with the loss of their colonies either way. So what happens to the lost Soviet land? I would say that the modern day borders of the post-Soviet states would happen, because why wouldn't they? Also, Germany gained some Polish lands and Poland is independent again. This would then bring us into the late 1960s, which is the age of decolonization for the other nations. The Dutch, Belgium, and any other state with colonies would slowly lose them. Countries like Indonesia, Angola, and many others will all gain independence. For Indonesia, a different story has happened. In our timeline, Indonesia had native rulers when the Japanese rampaged Asia. But without that, Indonesia would be behind by a lot. This may cause Indonesia to experience great horrors, as nobody would agree control over the government until it's the late 1980s. But shouldn't a Cold War be happening right now, you ask? Well, that's impossible. World War II, as we know, has fundamentally changed. The Americans are still isolationist, and the Soviets are gone. So yeah, there's gonna be no Cold War happening. Sorry viewers who wanted a Cold War scenario between the Axis and the Allies, it's not happening. The Americans would soon be the richest nation on Earth, with no close competitor. The Germans would come almost close, but they would still have the oligarchy stopping them fully reaching competitor status. I think after decades of oligarchy rule, the Germans would have had enough, and an armed group would storm the capital and they would place a democracy in charge of Germany. The old allied nations would be worried, but the newer government would make it clear they don't want war. And why would they? They have all the land they could ever want. From here it's going to be hard to predict because of how far we are from our time. But I think that the world would be calm now, at least for Europe and the Americas. In Africa, tons of wars would still be happening, and India and Pakistan would still be fighting. So, I guess this is a win. Well, now there's a huge African war. All the colonies are arguing over many things, but for a whole decade, they would be at war across Africa with no clear side winning. Only some minor border changes would be made. Now we are in the early 2000s, and no plane would fly around a certain pair of buildings. There is no war on terrorism, and the Americans would stay isolated. What a great time, right? Well, not really. There would still be major events missing in American history, so some people's rights may still be under threat. But other than that, this timeline is, if you're wondering, the internet would still happen, and some YouTuber called Alienese Mapping will create a video of what if World War II happened in 1939. Like that would ever happen, right? Am I right, guys? Anyways, what do you think of this video? Let me know down in the comments. You can also recommend video ideas. Maybe join the Discord, link is in the description, and goodbye.